For more now, let's bring in Alan Dershowitz, a former lawyer to OJ Simpson. Alan, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Your reaction to the news today?
Well, I wasn't surprised. I had heard he was sick and that he was in hospice. Of course, I was saddened by his death. I got to know him very well during the 2 years, essentially, where I was his lawyer. And, it was a very divisive case. People hated him, hated me for representing him. It was divided along racial lines. I would go to the airport and somebody would run up and hug me and say, "Oh my God, it's so great that you're defending Simpson." And inevitably that person was African American, or somebody would come up and spit at me and say, "How could you represent somebody who was so obviously guilty?" And they were generally white. The nuance, of course, is that whether he was guilty or innocent, and as a lawyer, I can never comment personally on my feelings about his guilt or innocence. Whether he was guilty or innocent, as a matter of fact, the evidence was overwhelming that he was framed. That is, the crucial piece of evidence, the sock, which had his blood and the blood of one of the victims on it, was tampered with. The blood was poured from test tubes, didn't come from OJ Simpson's body directly. It came from test tubes, and the test tubes contained a chemical that's not found in the human body, and that chemical was found in the sock. So we were able to prove conclusively that the police had tampered with it. And I was sitting literally just feet away from him when he tried on the glove. And as you can see, when he walked up to the jurors, he showed them the glove and he said, "It's too small." And that was a very important piece of evidence because it permitted him not to take the witness stand. He didn't have to take the witness stand because essentially he had already testified in front of the jury and was not subject to cross-examination. That was a foolish mistake by the prosecution. They didn't have to have him try on his glove in front of the jury. They could have had him try it on outside the presence of the jury, and if they saw it didn't fit, they wouldn't have used the evidence, but they didn't do that. They were arrogant, and it cost them in the mind of the jurors.
Do you think that the prosecution did a bad job as opposed to you guys doing an amazing job? Not to put you on the spot, but was that the case with this?
I don't think we did an amazing job. I think the prosecution did a worse than bad job, a god-awful job. They made every possible mistake in the book. We didn't win the case. They lost the case. To the extent we did a good job, it was the scientific evidence that was very persuasive to the jury. The EDTA in the blood that was found on the sock, the analysis of the forensics. We tried the case basically a science, and they tried the case very largely on speculation and on a piece of evidence that was tampered with. So it was a case of a very, very, very inadequate prosecution and pretty decent defense.
Let's go back to when you get the call, you're asked to join the team. You've represented some pretty famous clients. What was it like knowing you were going to be representing OJ Simpson in this case?
Well, I had represented Klaus von Bülow. I had represented lots and lots of people. I took his case because it was a capital case at the time. They were threatening to impose the death penalty on him, and I always take capital cases. The divisiveness was something that was unusual for me. The racial divisiveness. People would come over to me at in an airport and hug me, and inevitably they were black, and people would spit at me, and inevitably they were white. So it reflected the deep division among Americans based on racial criteria.
Now, I want to talk more about that, but going into the case at the end, when you're waiting the jury's decision, what were you expecting?
Well, I was with my students. I couldn't be at the verdict. It was the night of Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. And so I was in my office, and I had them all write on pieces of paper whether they thought there'd be a conviction or an acquittal. And most of them thought there'd be a conviction. Some of them thought there'd be a hung jury. Very few thought there'd be an acquittal. I actually thought there might be an acquittal because I knew about the tampered evidence. But it was a case that at the last minute nobody knew. There was an interesting piece of data. They discovered so many people were watching the case. Even the Supreme Court of the United States took a pause in its deliberations to watch the verdict on television. It was one of the most watched moments in television history, because normally you don't have advance notice that a verdict is coming down. But here, the verdict came down at night the night before, but we were told it wouldn't be revealed until midday the next day. So everybody knew exactly the moment it would come down, and everybody watched it.
And the result, was it what you expected?
Again, I was not surprised, and people who had seen the whole trial were not surprised. People who had read about it in the media were shocked because they had been given a distorted view. They hadn't been told, for example, much about the bloody sock, and the bloody sock was very instrumental in the jury's thinking about the case.
What was the impact? What kind of an impact did this trial have on future trials and the justice system?
Well, it showed several things. Number one, how deeply divided America was along racial lines. And number two, how corrupt the LA Police Department was, that it tolerated the kind of tampering with evidence that we were able to prove in this case. And, it also showed that the system is not simply, to use a bad term, in a case like this, black and white, that you can have a nuanced verdict. For many scholars who really understood the case, many of them thought he was factually guilty, but that the evidence against him had been tampered with, and therefore it was a just verdict, that there was an acquittal, because a conviction must be based on evidence that is real and legitimate and proved guilt beyond a reasonable doubt.
Now, of course, he was found responsible in the civil trial, though.
And he did take the witness stand in the civil trial, and that may have made the difference. He was not a good witness. I helped very much to persuade him not to take the witness stand in the criminal case, because he didn't have to, and you can't infer guilt from his not taking the witness stand, because he has a right not to in a criminal case, but not in a civil case. And because he had approached the jury with the glove, I didn't think it was necessary for him to take the witness stand, and that was the right judgment.
Now, in the nearly 30 years since this case, have things changed within the system?
Yes, I think they've improved. I think lawyers are more able to use forensic scientific evidence, and the police are less likely to try to plant evidence. The racial divisions haven't changed. We're an even more divided country today than we were 30 years ago. Today, we're divided along partisan political lines, religious lines, all kinds of lines. Back in the day, it was largely racial lines.
But you're still involved, though, and still not slowing down with it. What changes
Well,
would you like to see?
I'm 85 years old, and I'm going to stay active as long as the good Lord gives me the strength to defend people, and people will continue to be critical of me because of who I defend. That's the nature of the system.
Now, did you stay in touch with Simpson after this?
A bit, not much. I don't usually form relationships with my clients beyond professional relationships. They're like, doctors and patients. And so you generally lose touch, but I would talk to him every couple of years.
Did he seem different? Did he seem changed after the verdict?
He did. He did seem changed. He was, but he still refused to take a low profile. He wrote a very foolish book, What If I Had Done It? And he, on the night of the verdict, he appeared on Larry King. I had urged him to disappear. Nobody wanted to see his face or listen to his voice, but he didn't listen to me.
And as a lawyer, what is that like, trying to control somebody with that personality and that character?
It's always very difficult. I am sympathetic to Donald Trump's lawyers today for much the same reason.
Do you think it helped him during that trial to be more public, or would it have been even better to lay low?
During the trial, he wasn't particularly public. He was in prison, after all. He did serve time in the Los Angeles County Jail. And so we, the lawyers, played the major role in bringing the case to the public. And it's important. You defend clients not only in the courtroom, but you defend them on the courthouse steps, particularly when the prosecution was actively pursuing him in the court of public opinion as well.
And just one last question before we go. When was the last time you saw him or spoke to him?
A few years ago. I really didn't speak to him lately, and I wish I had, because I knew he was sick, but I didn't have the kind of relationship with him that would entitle me to call him when he was in hospice.
Okay. Alan, thank you very much for talking to us today.
Thank you.
Alan Dershowitz is the former lawyer to OJ